Hey everybody, welcome back to Lara Academy. It's Mickey once again, and we're going to be continuing on with the Laravel chat program that we started a few episodes ago. You can see that only a couple of things have changed. We have messages on the left, and then our ability to actually type the message in here on the right. If we were to try this right now, we click send a message, we'll just get a little pop-up here just saying send message. Let's switch over to Sublime and see what's actually happening. I have three files open here. We have our welcome, our routes.php, and the message controller. Inside routes, you can see everything is almost the same, except I've created this new route just called create and assigned a name to it. Inside the message controller, I've created the function here, and we're using some pretty standard Laravel rules. We're running a controller validate function here. If we weren't running Ajax on this request, the validate function here would stop processing any information below it, and it would return back to the page it was on with the errors. However, because this is Ajax, we'll see it will throw a different response with the rules filled into that message bag, and we'll take a look at how we can actually get those rules back out. So again, we're just running the validate. If everything is good, we're just going to create some content with the input of messages, and finally we're just returning the response and making sure is valid is set to true. In the welcome file, everything starting from the top you can see is pretty much the same. We have our basic jQuery messages here. Next we have a form, and we've just left that as blank for now, and we have our label for the messages, and we also have our text box and our button, which we can click to do send message. And you can see the send message function will just alert the user that we're about to send the message. The final change that I did here is in get messages. I added a run once option just because I wanted to make sure that when we send the messages we can actually get them, and we don't want to have the start messages continue to fire because it is set on a timeout. And I only want one timeout happening at a time. This just seemed like the easiest way around that. Now that seemed like a lot of explaining, but hopefully not too much, and let's get started on how we can start processing these messages. The first thing we'll do is we'll declare a variable called MSG, short for messages, and using jQuery we'll just pass in the selector and we'll get the value of our text box. We'll just double check that it's message, and it is, and let's just alert MSG, so alert the message. Back in Chrome we can make sure this is working just by entering in some messages. It seems that everything's working there, so our next step is to actually do the Ajax call. Now in the last video we used a GET request, and this is just a short form for the Ajax request. In this video we're going to be using POST. So just like our GET, our POST is going to accept a URL, and this we're going to grab from our routes. We'll say messages.create. Because we're working inside Blade, we have access to these functions. So we'll say route message create, and the next thing we need to pass in is the data. So in here we're going to pass in the message. So we'll make sure that in our controller what we're going to be checking for is the full word of message, and so we'll make sure that we're going to pass this in. So our variable is going to be message and it is going to be assigned MSG. The next parameter is a function call, and the function accepts a response, and we're only going to be in this function if we get a 200 success message, so we'll just add that comment in there. Now all of our post is going to do is return a response, and we're formatting it to JSON, and it's going to have a is a valid variable, so we can check that. We could say if response.isValid, and in here we know that the message was created successfully, or the content was added. And since the content was added successfully, let's clear out the messages, the message value that we have. Just have a comment for that. And the next thing we want to do is we want to run get messages, and we want to make sure that we only run this once. So we'll pass in true. So this is going to grab all the latest messages for us, including the message that we just did. Now remember, we're passing in true so that start messages doesn't get called, because inside start messages we have our timeout function, and we don't want to have multiple timeouts running at the same time for the same function. Now we know if we get a 200, we're going to come in here, but what happens if this validate fails? Well, in jQuery, there's a whole bunch of other functions that we can chain together on this post. Now we can use the .fail, so anytime we don't get a 200, we can run this function, which is going to accept, actually let's put response, and for now let's just do a console log on the response itself. So anytime we don't get a 200, we'll come into this fail option here. The last thing I want to do is make sure that this post function is going to be accepting a JSON value back, or that is what it thinks it is going to be getting. Now if we come back to Chrome, we refresh and load up our console, we try to send a message, you should see that we have an error here. It's a 500 error, which is normally pretty bad. If we switch over to the network and we click on create, you can see that we have a token mismatch exception. That's because we're not actually passing the token in with our request at all. And by default in Laravel, anytime we post this, we're going to have to put in the token. We have a few options here. Before we kind of looked at the Ajax setup. So we could do this where we're going to pass in some data for each of our requests. So we could just have the value data, and then we'll make a variable for token, and we will use the Laravel function CSRF token. Now with this setup, if we switch back to Chrome, you should notice a little bit of a problem here. Well, it's not much of a problem, but more of an annoyance. You can see that each of our GET requests, we're passing in that token every single time. We don't really need to do that, and there's multiple ways around this, but then we're getting into some things like a before send or even an Ajax filter. And these things I think we'll probably save for another video, and let's just work on keeping these things as simple as possible. So let's get rid of this Ajax setup entirely, and let's scroll down to our send message function. And let's actually add it in here. We will create a variable to hold all of our data that we're going to post, and we'll make sure that we're going to send our message itself. And the next thing we want to do is basically have a token and use that CSRF field to apply the token to this request. Once we have this information, we will replace this data with our variable data here. Just make sure that this matches up to whatever you put there. Now with everything saved, let's switch back to Chrome and let's give this a try. We'll refresh to make sure we get the latest JavaScript. We'll write something in our message and then we'll send it. You can see automatically it shows up here and our page hasn't refreshed. We have is valid is true, and it looks like everything's working. To prove that's working, let's load up two tabs here, and I'll just drag this to the side. And I'll drag this other one to the side, get rid of our console, and let's type a message in one of these to make sure that the other one refreshes. So we'll just say, hey there, and you can see on the left hand side, it's been picked up automatically. If we type something in on the left hand side and we send the message, well over on the right hand side, within 3 seconds, it will be refreshed with that new data. Now everything is working properly. The only thing I wanted to take a look at further is this fail function here. If we load up Chrome and we open our console and we just try to send an empty message, you can see that Laravel will throw a 422 error, and underneath, because we're logging the object out, you can see that we get the information, and this is what you would expect to see in the validator. So let's work on getting this out and usable. So the easiest way to do this is to work with the response JSON message itself. You can see by default we have an object and we only have one item here, so we can go into the message and we can keep drilling down, and finally we can just run the pop command to pop that last element, which then will get us the text itself. And for now we're not going to do anything fancy, but let's just put this into a span element underneath the text area. Now, like I said before, you'll probably want to be doing this a different way, but let's just keep it simple, and we'll have a span ID of errors, and we'll end that span, and we'll go inside our function to send the message. Now, whenever we're sending the message, we want to make sure that that errors message is set to nothing. So we'll use our selector, and we'll just make sure that the HTML is set to blank. And then finally, inside our fail, instead of using console.log, we'll just set the HTML to that response. Let's give it a try. We should be able to type something in here. And it looks like we have an error, and that's just on my part. We'll need to make sure the HTML is set to blank. If we try again, everything's working. Let's send a default. We get a message. Now let's type something in, and the message will disappear. So as you can see, everything's working, all our jQuery is working, and it's interacting back and forth. So there's not much else to do here. Now, I do also have the other window still open. So if we take a look at that, you should see that all the messages that we've been typing are automatically coming up. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.